Afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. We're about to start our last panel of the day. Localization, the new buzzword. Now, we've heard about it quite a few times throughout the day. Localization, local manufacturing. How can we increase this sector? 90%, and I think that number is slightly more, of our medical devices are currently imported. And what the COVID-19 pandemic showed us is that this puts us in a very fragile state where we are dependent on other nations to be able to take care of ourselves. In this panel, we're going to be discussing how we can increase local manufacturing, localization, and more of that. So I'd like you to join me in giving a big round of applause to my panelists who will join me on stage. So we have Dr. Nimrod Zalk, Acting DDG for Industrial Competitiveness and Growth for the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you. Dr. Michelle Mulder, Executive Director of the Grant Innovation and Product Development Unit at the South Africa Medical Research Council, and also Medical Device and Diagnostic Innovation Cluster Head. We've also got Colin Leshou, Provincial Manager at the SEDA Gauteng, and Jeremy Wallis, Impact Area Manager, Industrial Sensors at CSIR. Let's give them a round of applause as they come through. Welcome, panelists. It is my honor and pleasure to have you all here. So as we kick off this conversation, one thing that I got to learn about whilst researching all of you was the Healthcare Products Master Plan, and how this really seeks to unlock industrialization, to rejuvenate and grow the healthcare industry. But my question was, what is the ultimate objective of this plan, and where does the medtech sector or the suppliers fit into this? And I'd like to ask you, Dr. Zalk.
Well, first of all, thanks, and thank you very much for inviting DTRC to be here. I think most of the master plans, all of the master plans across various sectors have some fairly common objectives. So that would be really kind of collaboration between industry, government, labor, to look at ways in which the industry can be grown fundamentally, in which greater employment can be created directly and indirectly, areas where it's possible for us to engage in feasible import replacement, as well as areas where we can export more. In terms of the health and the medical devices master plan, I think there's an added dimension which has come up earlier, which is really around our experience with the COVID-19 crisis and the issue of the resilience of the health sector. We know that, there was vaccines is probably the biggest example. First of all, a scramble to develop vaccines, and then a scramble to access vaccines. But I think there are a number of areas where we are vulnerable. Just a very basic example I understand is that as a country we don't produce the fundamental active pharmaceutical ingredient for the most basic kind of pain medication for paracetamol, which is acetaminophen. I hope I'm pronouncing that accurately for the medical people in the audience. So I think broadly speaking, those objectives together with far greater resilience, linking it to far greater resilience, and I think opportunities that arise both in South Africa and more broadly on the continent would be the main focus areas.
And I can imagine that innovation within the medtech sector is quite important in regards to that. And I also believe that that's where the MeDDIC, the Medical Device and Diagnostic Innovation Cluster, plays an important role in supporting innovation in the sector. So how do you see this, Dr. Michelle? What is needed in order to create an ecosystem where medtech companies can thrive?
So I think if you think about the ecosystem approach, it's the players, it's the policies, it's the enabling environment. So What we want is a healthy, well-functioning, cohesive, and very well-aligned ecosystem where all of those who can contribute to development, manufacture, selling, export, and implementation of new devices work together. Ideally, we want a seamless innovation process. I don't think we'll ever get to that point. But where the main players work together and where there's a common goal. So pre-competitive collaboration, looking at how the different sectors can come together and collaborate and jointly address the bottlenecks within the industry, get that critical mass to get policy changes, to bring in the support that's needed. So I think having a real healthy ecosystem is vital if you want to go all the way, particularly from ideation down to the market. I think our medtech industry is healthy, as it's very well supported by SAMED and the industry organizations. But if we look all the way upstream and getting new products into the market, I think there's still a lot of gaps, and it's certainly not a well-oiled machine as yet.
Now, I want to talk about some of those gaps later on, but before we dive into that, Colin, I'd like to hear from your perspective, where are the bottlenecks when it comes to local manufacturing and localization?
Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you for inviting us. I think that SEDA, as the Small Enterprise Development Agency, when we look at, especially within the medical field, there's not a lot that's happening within the small business space. And what we are saying is that there's definitely opportunities for small businesses to come on board and, do some of the stuff that is needed in the country. I think some of the bottlenecks that we have found was access to finance, because you find that a lot of times when SMMEs come, especially within the medical field, that because of the fact that some of those things we don't understand, and it's something that we need to be very, persistent on, as well as be actually truthful about, that a lot of times when people don't understand something, they are not really willing to fund it. So I believe that from a Department of Small Business Development, together with its agencies, it's about high time that we look at how do we get ourselves to the point of looking at these businesses that's coming, especially within the health sector, and how do we then fund them. Access to markets is another one, because of the fact that, like I'm saying, we normally predominantly look at businesses that's in the services sector, except for medical, etc. It is not always easy to then look at those businesses and say, you know what, we understand where the market is. Although research has proven that as a country, we need to look at these businesses because they are just as important as any other business. Just to give an idea, a couple of months ago, we started working with a doctor that came to us and said, look, we just want you guys to do, your normal type of interventions for people within or businesses within the medical field. And we've seen such an influx of medical practitioners, people that want access to some of our own interventions that we have to assist them with, some of the work that they do. So I would say access to markets, access to finance. It is also that doctors sometimes or people within the medical field do not really understand, some of the lingo that we use within entrepreneurship and within the business world. So that is why, from our perspective, we then understand and we know that we need to go out there and do a lot of business development training as well, because that is needed within the market. But I also believe when we speak about localization and we look at what has happened and transpired after COVID, is that we've seen how entrepreneurs and small businesses could come into the space and really just completely change it. We've got one of our own incubators in Cape Town within the biomedical space that is currently doing, or they are manufacturing their own rapid test for COVID. So we've seen how that has changed what is happening within and leveling the playing field for these entrepreneurs, because a lot of these big businesses are able to tap into the DTIC. But what about small businesses? How are they being affected with what is happening in the country? We've seen that we've shed 2 million jobs, in the last 2 years, and we know that some of those jobs would be able to come from the medical field, and seeing that whatever we can do to assist them with that.
Thank you. Now, Jeremy, you are involved in research with the CSIR. Would you agree with what Colin is saying in terms of access to finance, people not necessarily understanding what they're financing, and how can we solve for this?
Yeah, look, one of the things that we were involved in at CSIR quite early in the pandemic was actually trying to help small companies and entrepreneurs actually get new products, switch a manufacturing line to PPE or something and get it out. And one of the things that was a major stumbling block, so I was part of a group of people from industry and academia or whatever who came together. But one of the things we noticed was that even where there was funding available, the funding rules that you apply during a pandemic maybe need to be a little bit different to the funding rules that you apply outside of a pandemic. Would be so as an example, you sit with somebody who looks like they have a factory, they have all the energy in the world to actually get into a new business and produce new products. They're going to solve some of your local supply challenges in the short term. There's a pandemic going on, let's do it. But then they get asked up front for proof of offtake and things that they'll actually be able to sell these things. You understand the market demand. How much that demand can you get, and please prove it to me, which all makes sense in terms of judging a business for viability outside of a pandemic. But I think inside the pandemic it would have been quite useful to have alternative funding maybe available. It could have been administered by the same people who understand how to do it, but just with slightly different rules, so that we could have got things. So many companies we spoke to, and we must have spoken to 20 or more, were stuck at the same point, trying to get some funding to move forward. So, yeah.
And that's quite an important point, because we talk about being able to be action ready, being able to step into that value chain, to add value, but you have to be prepared. So I'm curious to find out, are we prepared now? I mean, we've just gone through 2 years of what I call craziness, unprecedented times. How prepared are we for, I don't want to say the next pandemic, because I like being an optimist, but for the next shock, be it an economic shock, a health shock? How prepared are we? And I'm going to ask you this question, Dr. Zalk.
I mean, I think others might know a lot better than I do, people in the medical field, but my assessment is that I would say we're partially prepared, and perhaps the COVID experience has helped us develop some capabilities, boosted some capabilities, but it probably would be an exaggeration to say that we are fully prepared. I think the kind of areas that we showed that we're able to rapidly kind of mobilize capabilities was obviously in areas like PPE, the easier to do, if you like, sanitizers and so on. Also, I think that there was a demonstration of this kind of ability to do lean innovation around the ventilator project, which I think CSIR was fundamentally involved in. More broadly, I think that it has somewhat boosted our capacity around vaccine production. And that's not just for kind of COVID vaccines, but more broadly to produce kind of childhood vaccines. But again, if we aren't producing the APIs for paracetamol, then I don't think we can claim that we are fully prepared for the next shock. I think maybe the last point is just that I think we need to think kind of continent-wide as we prepare for greater resilience, and that is both what are the things that South Africa could produce for the continent, and are there areas that other countries with some medical capabilities on the continent, complementary products that they could produce. This is a lot. I mean, one of the massive issues in this industry is obviously scale, and again, you're unlikely to be able to produce APIs at adequate scale if you're only producing for one country.
Very true.
Yeah.
That's a good point, actually. Yes, Dr. Mulder.
If I could add to that, so I think this comes down to the very topic we're talking about today, is localization. And the more we can build localization, have those PPE the ventilators as a matter of course manufactured in South Africa. So you no longer are reliant on imports and global supplies. So when they do get cut off, we can be self-sufficient. But I think beyond that, what COVID has shown us is, or what it's done is it's invoked this incredible response. So, I mean, the number of meetings we get invited to around pandemic preparedness. We've set up a unit, a research unit around pandemic preparedness. I think there's an institute in the making in South Africa around pandemic preparedness. And I mean, just one of the initiatives which I think could be looked at as a model for the MeDDIC sector is the mRNA hub. The MRC is involved in that together with Afrigen and Biovac, where, and it's a global initiative with WHO and Medicines Patent Pool, and it's setting up right now the capability to manufacture mRNA-based vaccines in South Africa and other low and middle income countries, but beyond that, looking at how we can develop and manufacture additional vaccines so that we can very rapidly respond. So we're building the technology and expertise to very rapidly respond to the next pandemic. We've got the surveillance, the genomic surveillance in place. We've got the preclinical in place. You're now getting the manufacturing in place. So when it happens again, we will be prepared to do that, to respond. And I know it's quite late now to be putting new mRNA vaccines onto the market when, we do have availability now. But what it means is we can produce our own, we will be able to produce our own mRNA-based vaccines for COVID for that annual jab that is likely going to be needed by everybody.
That's such important points. Thank you so much for adding to that, because it gives us quite a bit of clarity in terms of where we currently are in terms of localization. Now, Dr. Zalk, you mentioned that you had previously partnered with the CSIR. I'm curious, Jeremy, does the CSIR intervene beyond R&D innovation when it comes to MedTech and localization?
Yeah, we've, obviously in the pandemic, we were one of the participants in that national ventilator program, I think, which was very successful at the time. And, we actually managed to get the ventilators developed and out in something like 6 months into the market, which kind of broke all records even for us, I think, doing that kind of stuff. But beyond that, doing the R&D, the group that I'm a part of at the CSIR, we call ourselves Industrial Sensors. We do a range of sensor-related products in defense and in transport and energy and so on, and medical devices is actually one of them. The way we would be different to, say, a company in the way we operate is when we developed, as an example, our own 13485 ISO quality management system for the group. So within government, we've now got our group that actually has that in place. So we needed it to do our own medical devices, but we also decided that would be an appropriate mechanism to actually assist other companies. Mm-hmm. So beyond just doing the R&D, we have started now as part of the MeDDIC program. There is some funding that came our way about 1.5 years ago, where we started engaging with companies. So any SMME, small company, the big companies kind of know what they're doing. They have these systems in place. So we've started supporting the companies now, smaller companies, the new entrants, entrepreneurs, if you like, to understand the medtech sector, to understand the regulatory side of things, to help them with the product development aspects of it and so on. We've probably engaged just over 20 companies in the last 1.5 years, of which about 15 we're currently still engaged with and supporting. Most of them are in the Class A devices, which is the lower risk devices. So there's less regulatory hurdles there for you to get started. But just guiding companies, triaging, if you like, and helping them in all manner of directions. And so some of the companies we've been able to help in our classical technical areas, others we've guided them in terms of the regulatory side, which they had no clue about. But we've also been able to point them in the direction where they have the most needs. We've pointed certainly people towards SEDA. I was in Port Elizabeth a couple of weeks ago with a company who was showing us all their marketing material and websites and everything that's come together, and that was a SEDA grant. We've pointed them to the Department of Small Business Development. We've ended up with companies going through to IDC for funding and so on. SABS as well, making connections there for them. And where necessary, we have helped them. They need to do product testing or they need to do material testing. Yeah. We've been able to actually, with our own networks, find linkages for them. And just help them kind of unblock the path getting to market. So it's using that capability not just for our own purposes to make medical devices, but to help others as well.
And in what I'm hearing, there's a lot of partnerships happening. It actually feels a little bit like a family reunion right now. But Colin, from your perspective, I mean, what are some of the partnerships that have been successful, and where can we see partnerships taking the industry further?
Okay. So I must say, in terms of our partnerships, we've been partnering with the CSIR, we've been partnering with the Department of Higher Education, with the Department of Science and Innovation, and from the private sector, we've seen how a lot of private sector partners are coming on board now. I think in the last 2-3 years, SEDA also then realized that, you know what, as per our mandate, we are the ecosystem facilitator, so we need to bring all these partnerships on board. One thing that we are looking at the moment is a medical devices cluster for small businesses. And that is something that is taking shape. It's really great, the work that's been happening and where we're going with it currently. I think SAMED, obviously, one of our partners that we would like to see coming on board more, so that we can really get that type of, just influence within the private sector. And we will come on board and we will do whatever we need to do to make sure that it's a success. Just on partnerships from the Export Credit Insurance Corporation, which is mostly looking at, what is happening in countries when we want to invest there, from a political, from, any form they would go into, and they would look at what's happening in those countries, but they would also fund. So we found that most of these entities come on board and they are able to assist us with funding as well, so that we can really look at how do we make sure that people within this field are then taken care of. Just something else which is not in the medical devices sector, but I mean something as cannabis, as small as cannabis, we've started looking at that, and we've seen how different entities are coming on board and assisting us in terms of an incubator that we would like to establish there. So we are looking at a medical devices cluster. We are looking at medical, specifically in the health sector, an incubator as well, because we are currently having 122 incubators that SEDA is funding, but there's not one in the medical field. So we would like to make sure that the medical field becomes part and parcel of what we are doing, and that they would be able to assist us in driving the mandate for small enterprise development in South Africa. I think we've also seen a lot of interest from the Swiss. We've seen a lot of interest from the European Union. We are currently being funded by the European Union for this medical devices cluster. And it's really, it's just shown us that there's interest in what is happening medically in South Africa, and how that could potentially change the trajectory not only of South Africa but of the continent. And we would like to make sure that continental players come on board as well, because that's the only way that we would be able to change what is currently happening within that space.
Very true, and that brings me to Dr. Mulder. So in what we're hearing, there's a lot of talk on innovation. There's a lot of talk, and I mean, it kind of goes together, medical devices, medical technology. But is there a space for non-innovative medical technologies to be produced locally? So your more traditional, I want to call it bread and butter medtech, is there room for that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the figures show that 90% by value of medical devices consumed in South Africa, are imported. So, if we can increase the local manufacture of those and not rely on imports, but also develop the local industry, job creation, economic development, etc., that goes with that. So we recently did a call. In fact, about more than a year ago now, we did a funding call specifically looking at products that were not new. Nothing innovative about them. We just wanted companies to come to us and say, if you give us a little bit of seed funding, we can actually produce that product here. And that product at the moment is entirely imported or largely imported, or even just a component of a largely imported product. And we funded 4 companies in that arena, and they're still finishing off their projects now, so I can't say. One of them is certainly been successful, and the others are very much on the way, and I think the one company is the one that Jeremy's talking about in PE. So, you know, it just goes to show, and the figures that they've shown to us, you know, the savings, the local revenues that can be produced just from simply bringing manufacture of an existing product into the country. And in fact, one company is even going further now to say, we're not just going to manufacture this product, we want to manufacture the tool that is needed to make that product, which we're currently having to spend a lot of money to bring in from the US. So we're going further up the value chain, and we're getting this domino effect of localization through these projects.
Yes, Jeremy.
Yeah, maybe just to add is that you know, sometimes even though it may look simple, there can be quite a lot going on in that simple medical product. But if medical device companies actually have ideas, are not entirely sure about the tech that's involved or missing a part of that tech, that is a great opportunity to contact us and also Michelle at the MRC around doing some of that development and advising, and you know, because we have certain technologies under our belts, but the ability to develop new ones. And we're very keen as an organization to promote localization. So as I say, if medtech companies do have a product they want to produce locally, they're not quite sure of the tech involved, please approach us. You know, we have 5 strategic objectives as an organization that have come out of our most recent strategization. And I think the second one actually literally has the word localization now in it. You know, so it's part of the government's intention to use the CSIR in that way.
So just one question. What products are we talking? What are these?
So the one example I gave is a cutting burr. The other one, which Jeremy's talking about, is synthetic liners for prosthetics, which are currently out of reach for those in the public sector due to cost. So, and then there's a component of an injection needle. So yeah, they're simple, they're not high-tech, you know, fancy electronic products, but they can actually make a huge difference in terms of cost and local development as well.
And reducing our import bill.
Absolutely.
Colin,
Absolutely.
you had some comments?
Yes, I think I just wanted to latch on to that. So we would actually fund their technology if they want to bring it into the country. I'm not going to go into all of our, you know, financial instruments, but we've got an instrument that would definitely look at technology, our technology transfer assistance funding, and we would then fund entrepreneurs and small businesses that would like to bring that into the country. That's all I want to do.
So now we've got funding, we've got research, we've got market access. So where is the bottleneck in terms of actually improving the state of localization now? And I'm going to latch on to some of what we often hear across industries. Very often regulatory policy is what gets in the way. Is this the case in this scenario, Dr. Zalk?
I mean, I think that these kind of conversations about regulatory barriers kind of really benefit the more specific you get rather than, you know, kind of broad brush statements about the regulatory environment. Just reviewing the research that has been done thus far, and incidentally largely coordinated by my colleague Swashti Sumaru, who's sitting in the audience and has been mostly driving this work. I think there are undoubtedly a few key regulatory issues that jump out for me. I think the first one is it seems like it's quite difficult to register medical devices with the SAMRC. So that seems to be a very significant issue. I mean, obviously in this space you want to have very robust kind of quality control and regulations. I mean, I don't think it's not about cutting corners, but how can we expedite those approvals? I think another area is looking at, particularly as we think about export markets, where does it make sense to adopt, for instance, EU standards for the South African market, so that we comply, and companies that are producing kind of, have to comply with those EU standards, and then that, automatically helps them get a footprint into export markets. So I think those are some of the major regulatory issues. I think some of the funding issues have been raised already. Yeah.
So, thank you. Yes, Jeremy.
Yeah, maybe just on the regulatory side. I mean, like we've got a medical device, that medical ultrasound device that we developed in our team, which is currently sitting in Canada, because we haven't got anybody locally who's been accredited to do the certifications. So we do have testing laboratories in the country, and there's a number of them, but they are accredited only for certain tests that they can do. They have the ability to do those tests, and so we would usually use them to do the test locally at a low cost, just to make sure that everything's working. Then you send it overseas for the official test where they've got an accredited laboratory. But, I think if we're going to improve the ecosystem for medical devices, we need to look at those test laboratories, certainly. Some of the tests that they do, this one is an electrical safety test. I mean, really, it's not rocket science, and we do it for non-medical devices quite happily in the country. But it's not economic for that company to set it up just for medical. So, we need to have like a transition period. Maybe those companies are giving grants or whatever to make sure they set it up and maintain it, so they can cover their costs. And then the whole sector would actually benefit. So that's one of the regulatory issues. Another is the notified bodies. If there's going to be a requirement at some point for companies to all have the 13485 certification. To bring, we've got auditors coming in 2 weeks' time to check our annual surveillance audit, and they're flying in from overseas again. It's an incredibly expensive exercise to do that. So if we have local notified bodies and auditors and so on, and then there are discussions taking place around with, I know that Michelle's involved in discussions with SEDS and so on, but if we can have local notified bodies that actually have local auditors that can do these things for us, that also would unlock the path somewhat.
Why do we not have these auditors locally? I don't know who would be most appropriate to answer.
I don't know if it's just been market demand. I mean, there are certainly lots of consultants around who understand the regulatory field really well, and I've had the privilege to work with a lot of them, and they help you get ready for those audits. But the auditors, I just don't think there's a volume in the country. But it'll probably increase, when all companies at some point have to register. Thankfully, those dates have been put off for a while, but that's probably what it is, demand. But again, if we can have a period where that is incentivized for companies to have local auditors and so on based here, it would go a long way.
And to Dr. Michelle's point earlier, servicing one country may be just too small for certain organizations, that we must look at a regional, a continental approach rather. But on that note, actually, another thing that comes up quite a lot when we're speaking, or at least when I'm engaging with businesses on the topic of local manufacturing, local content production, is that of infrastructure. Do we have the infrastructure required to be able to maximize on the opportunities in South Africa? Dr. Mulder, is this a question for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, yes. So we did a survey of the medical device sector a couple of years ago, and the report came out earlier this year. And interestingly, we only surveyed manufacturers, not importers or distributors, and we surveyed the innovation sector as well. Mm-hmm. Of the manufacturers, I think there were about more than half who said that they actually had downtime, so they had infrastructure and facilities available that were not fully utilized. Wow. Now, maybe that's because they don't have the demand to have full shifts and to have those facilities running at full time, and maybe that's what needs to be addressed first. But our second experience with this is we were approached by an overseas company who wanted to set up component assembly for their COVID molecular diagnostic tests in South Africa. So they asked us to look around and see if there were any companies who were interested but also had the right facilities. And they were looking for the smallest, couple of rooms, clean rooms, with somebody manually packing and so on. And we did manage to find a few, but I think each of those companies still would have had to put a little bit of investment in to get to what was needed. So I think the facilities are there, but one of the things that did come out of the survey was a lack of or shortage of funding for infrastructure development and expansion within the industry. So I think it could certainly do with some attention.
Okay. Colin, from your perspective, do you agree?
Absolutely, I agree. I think and I'm always going to refer back to small businesses. From a small business perspective, we have what we call the Small Enterprise Infrastructure Fund. So we've got a facility or a financial instrument for entrepreneurs that would like infrastructure in the country. I also believe that we've done exactly the same type of research where we found that a lot of people do have downtime. And for us, it was how do we augment what they have within their facilities and not having to go out and build new facilities. If they are able to do it, let's then assist them and see how best they can then, increase volumes from wherever they are at. But I also do believe that just from new, we would be able to assist with that. We also have the small manufacturing support program. So the Small Business Manufacturing Support Program, which is also within the manufacturing space, and obviously that is something that we could potentially look at. A point of contention sometimes would be triple BEE, but from just a black business perspective, we've got the Black Industrialist Program that would also look at how do we assist, black entrepreneurs in terms of coming into the space. And all of these programs are literally there to make sure that we are able to look at how do we assist in job creation again and just the industrialization of the country. So absolutely, I also believe that there is space, there's room for improvement. We've got the facilities, but if we need more, we've got the funding for that as well.
That is great. So before we continue, we've actually got a poll which is going to show up on your app. So that poll, there we go. You can scan the QR code, yes. What are some of the barriers to localization? I'd love to get your perspective from this. And very shortly, we'll also be taking Q&A, so you can start thinking about some of the questions that you'd like to ask. Just going to give 1 minute for those insights to come through. So we're seeing raw materials, funding, politics, access to capital, funding, access to markets, cost, labor, policy. So quite a few things that we've already touched upon. So I think in terms of understanding where the barriers and the bottlenecks are, I think we've touched upon most of them. So let's move to solutions. What are some of the solutions that we can implement as of now to increase localization in the sector? Dr. Zalk, I'd like to start with you.
Well, I think this is really at the heart of the master plan process itself. And I think it requires a number of interventions. So just to name a few, we need to address some of the regulatory issues that we've spoken about. The things like testing facilities, understanding what is feasible to kind of raise the capabilities of testing facilities in South Africa in an environment where our standards institutions have, I think, really suffered from declines in funding. I think really working together, public and private sector, to identify areas where there is scope to produce locally at scale, identifying continental opportunities, again, emphasizing the issue of scale, refining the funding programs that are available. I think those are some of the main areas that I think should come out of the master plan process.
Brilliant, thank you. Dr. Mulder?
I'm smiling because everything that came up is exactly what came up in our survey. Just like a mirror of what we found in the survey. So we've already started to look at some solutions. Regulatory okay, funding came out the largest here, but in our survey, regulatory was probably number one. And so we've already convened a meeting of some stakeholders a couple of months ago to start talking about what those issues are and how we can start to address them. So we had SAMED, MDMSA, SAPRA, some of the industry. Jeremy was there, CSIR, and others. And we and unfortunately, I went into there quite optimistic that we could, because we actually do have some money to throw at the problem as well. But not much came out of it. I think there was a lot of pessimism about what we could do about the barrier which Jeremy was talking about, which is the biggest cost barrier for everyone, I think, is this maintaining your certification and CE marks and getting that CE mark. So, and the logistics of that, I think, are something we can't solve too quickly by just throwing money at the problem. I think we really need to think creatively about how we can solve that. The things we can solve, which we came to the conclusion on, is the skills. So one of the things that came up is the lack of skills within companies about the processes and the requirements and the documentation. And that's why the MeDDIC grant to CSIR, I think, has been very useful, is guiding companies through that process. And the CSIR don't replace the regulatory consultants who sit there and write and assist in a more in-depth level. But what this does is it just guides them as to what to expect, where to find the templates, and what sort of process, and also what classification they're looking at. The other thing is we're working with SAPRA on getting all of the medical device products that are sitting on those establishment licenses into a database so that they can get themselves geared up for the actual call-up of medical devices. And sorry, just getting back to the skills side, is we would like to work with Westgrow and others who are looking at internship programs. So looking at getting those from industry to go and sit within companies who've been through the process or going through the process and learn so they can take those learnings back to their own companies. We're also working with Stellenbosch University and the Medical Devices Cluster in the Western Cape on specifically a regulatory course, which they've developed, and we're now looking to see how we can get it over the finish line and get people onto that course. So there's a number of solutions that we're coming up with, but just to say also, in around November, we're going to be holding a workshop of stakeholders in the medical devices sector to look at the other main barriers that came out of that survey and to start workshopping, where do we go from here and how do we fix them.
Quite a few solutions there. Thank you for sharing. Colin?
I think from where we are sitting is that, so from a regulatory perspective, we are really working on, red tape reduction. And this is just from a business perspective. A couple of years ago, South Africa was about 45th in the world in terms of the ease of doing business. Today, we're sitting at 98th. So it means we've regressed in terms of the ease of doing business in South Africa. I think that some of the things that was already touched on, we could potentially help. I mean, we've got a quality and standards unit that works very closely with the labs in terms of, productivity, in terms of certification, trademarks, patents, etc., product packaging, a whole myriad of services that we have. And for entrepreneurs and SMMEs, that service is free. So we would pay the labs for that service, whether it's ISO, etc. I think from an access to markets perspective, we do quite a lot of work in terms of access to markets and how do we make sure that we create that opportunities for entrepreneurs and SMMEs, not only on the continent, but we look further than the continent. But I think for us, a starting point is really looking at the continent, starting with SEDA and then moving out. Then with regards to access to finance, we've got quite a number of different financial instruments that we have that entrepreneurs and SMMEs could potentially apply for. I spoke about our technology transfer assistance program where we would assist with technology that you would like to buy within the or purchase within the business. I spoke about manufacturing, the Small Enterprise Manufacturing Fund, and there's quite a number of other funds that people can, or businesses could apply for medical devices, and for any other business that they would want to operate in as well. Then in terms of just, some of the other things that we have, there's quite a myriad of different interventions as an organization that we have. We work very closely with the banks, other financiers, like-minded or similar, institutions that could come in. If we don't have the capital, if we do not have the know-how, then we would want to bring in people that could potentially assist us in terms of moving forward with what we spoke about today. Then also, something that is very interesting for us is that I saw one of the things that was spoken about is political. And we try and keep that outside of what we do, as we, although an agency of government, but we don't really, or politicians really don't interfere with the work that we do, because we believe that we are the ones that understand the work, and they need to, really do what they are good at.
Empowered to do.
Exactly. And another myth, because, and I think it's things we need to speak about as a country. A lot of times people think it's only for BEE, etc. All of our services is for any South African. So wherever you are at, you can come, you can apply for our services, and we will definitely assist you wherever you are at in your business.
Thank you. And all of the panelists will be here during the networking session, so we'll be able to ask individualized questions later on. For the purposes of time, we'll now open up the floor to questions and answers. So if you can raise your hand if you have a question. Got 1, 2, and I'll take a last one. 3, okay, and then 5 go up. 1, 2, 3, and that's all we'll have time for, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you so much for an interesting discussion. I think we can all agree that localization or reindustrialization is really at the core of the economy and will drive the economy to the next level. But having said that, Dr. Mulder touched a little bit on this. Some of the technology will have to come from outside. So basically it will have to be imported. So my question is, what kind of environment are we creating to encourage technology transfer into the country? I'm going to give an example. So if we look at the IVD industry, some or most of these products have been already established, developed outside the country. But you want to increase production locally, but you want to tap into the technology that is already developed. How do we encourage tech transfer instead of us buying products from out of the country? Can we encourage local production of this product through technology transfer from the experts, if you may? That's the first question. Then my second question is with regards to access to funding. Although there's many routes or many companies or organizations out there that are making funding accessible, but at the same time, you also have instances where the environment is not so open to everybody. You have to know somebody to get access to funding. It can be frustrating sometimes for startup companies because to a certain extent that is a barrier to funding. How are we addressing those kind of challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to respond to the first question?
I'm happy to. So I think the key thing is we have to create an attractive environment to attract technology transfers here, and we have to show that we've got the expertise to do it. So this company I was talking about that wants to do component manufacture for COVID diagnostics, I think their main motivation was they see us as the springboard to the rest of Africa, the one thing. The second, they got into a lot of flack about global supply during COVID because we were not able to access their reagents. And I think what they realized is that if they were going to look for a second manufacturing or third or whatever manufacturing base, they needed to start looking in low and middle income countries, not just for the brownie points it gets them, but because there's capability there, and it gets them, a springboard into markets that they might not already have access to. So I do think that actually the medtech sector here is ripe for for inward tech transfers. We've got the skills, we've got a lot of the infrastructure, we've got the capabilities. So I don't know that there's much more we could be doing to prepare for that.
Brilliant. And then the second question with regards to access to funding. Would you like to take it, Colin?
I could take that, yes. So in terms of access to finance, obviously what would be looked at the beginning is, do you have an offtake? What is it that you have in place? But then also there's funding for greenfields, where most probably, it's an open field. There's nothing that has done yet. So in that sense, you wouldn't really have, your offtakes, etc. I believe that speaking from a SEDA perspective, so SEDA is our Small Enterprise Finance Agency, which is our sister agency, they have automated their system now, because previously people sometimes waited 12 months to get, some form of answer from them in terms of whether your application was successful or not. So that was automated about a month ago. And what I wanted to share was that we've got actually a system in the country. It's a website called FinFind. So FinFind, if you go onto FinFind, it will ask you questions, and it will use then artificial intelligence to then pick up, which financier, what type of financier you would most likely be able to use within your business. I also believe that although we are speaking about finance, we also need to speak about the non-financial assistance, because non-financial assistance is just as important as financial assistance. And that is where we would prepare you if you are going to go out and see, a financier, that you would know what they are looking at. You would know some of and again, the language that is spoken about. Break-even analysis. How do you know where you are breaking even within your business, etc.? Asset test, what is an asset test? How do you look at it? And for us, it is important that, entrepreneurs and SMEs know that there is help out there. So FinFind, I would say, would be your first tool that you would use, because it will tell you exactly which financier would most probably fund you. If you do have issues with SEFA, which is in our stable, you can contact me directly.
Brilliant. Thank you, Colin. And Jeremy, would you like to add?
Just on the tech transfer side, one of the companies we've been helping in the last while was in a position where an overseas company was doing tech transfer to them of a particular PCR device. There was because the company overseas was changing its business around, they were divesting from something, but it was still quite viable technology. But the person to receive it at this end didn't necessarily have the skills to understand if everything in that data pack was actually there. And so from CSIR side, we actually jumped in at some point to help the person. We actually received 2 gigabytes of files from the foreign company, which we started to go through, and the product. And then we just pulled it apart, and we worked out we back-engineered, if you like, the data pack for them, so they could actually locally manufacture. So if that's an issue for companies, again, contact us.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. We'll now take the second question. I'm just going to ask to keep it brief, just to make sure that we can respect the panelists and everyone's time.
Oh, thank you. I'm thinking beyond local production to meeting our needs, if that makes sense. So I moved here 15 years ago from UK. And from working in wound care, I know our burns are bigger here in South Africa, and our wounds are typically more complex, if that makes sense. So how do we integrate into our local element, not just local production, but actually genuinely meeting the needs of South Africa from a healthcare perspective? We have the occasional first world problem, but most of our problems are South African problems, if that makes sense. So yes, tech transfer, great, but for what? What is the end result going to be, and is it something that actually genuinely meets the needs of South African healthcare problems, is what I'm thinking. And I'll use COVID as an example. We had everything in South Africa to make a mucosal vaccine. At the end of the day, we knew we had a mucosal problem, and we knew we had the capability to perhaps look at a different way of tackling COVID, but we've gone with what's come from somewhere else instead as a solution. So how do we put the notion of really genuinely solving our own problems locally together with local production? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle this one?
I'm happy to. We, as a funder of health research and innovation at the MRC, our very first port of call is to go to the Department of Health, is to look at the National Health Research Committee, what their priorities are, the SDGs, we look at what are the priorities. So we design our calls around what's needed. But that's at a higher level. What we don't get down to and what we haven't got right yet is the granular level. So what kind of wound product do you need? And what kind of wound product works in the hands of the rural clinic, the nurse assistant at the rural clinic, etc. And one of the things we're advocating for, and we've put in the recommendations of the report, is this much bigger role from the very beginning of the end user in designing the product. So that end user needs to walk the journey with the innovator from the start, setting out the target product profile, and then, based on that, what should the design be, and then a constant user testing and refinement as you go along. And I think that's largely missing in our academic innovator sector. I think the MeDDIC companies who are innovating are probably better at that because they're closer to the end user. Mm-hmm. But I think that getting that right, and it's something that's one of our priorities of how to do that, how to better engage with the end user right up front.
And I think it's something we'll most likely touch upon in tomorrow's panel at 11:50 on value-based healthcare, where we're looking at how we can do healthcare not based on price points or corporate objectives, but rather on best treatment available for the patients. Jeremy?
Yeah, if I can break protocol by asking a question to the panel myself.
No, you're more than welcome to.
I was just wondering if part of all these kind of things that's happening, whether we are looking strategically for the country going forward on what medical devices should be, or what medical capabilities. So we know vaccines is an obvious one. Is there use of I know the WHO has done the priority medical devices where they link burden of disease to medical devices and so on. Is there a process planned where we will come out and say that we need to actually have strategic capabilities in the following?
Not that I'm aware of, although I'm hoping that they would be part of the health tech master plan process.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that I'm not aware of any comprehensive process to do that, and it certainly is an important exercise to engage with. I think one of the things we grapple with, take antiretrovirals, for instance, is this whole question of, so when we procure for public health care, kind of what kind of premium or what kind of pricing should we apply that takes into consideration the broader, social considerations? How do you, I think one of the problems with our kind of accounting type of framework is, first of all, it doesn't take into account all the spillovers from local production versus importation. It cannot, it doesn't even attempt to calculate the value of having those local capabilities, because it's very much a case of, we have this global market, we can buy whatever we need until you can't. So, I think that whole question is a very, very big consideration, and that really is I think, something that should factor more prominently in when Department of Health and in turn National Treasury kind of establish the envelope for procurement of critical pharmaceuticals and devices. But I don't think we're anywhere near that stage.
Okay. We'll take the very last question and we'll try and answer it briefly as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I think I'd like to speak on behalf of both multinationals and local manufacturers. From a multinational perspective, I think we need to be very clear that we're competing with countries across Africa for investment into South Africa. And actually at this point, if you had to look at the attractiveness of South Africa as an investment destination versus countries like Egypt or perhaps even Turkey, where the tools exist and the incentives exist, they are far more attractive than we are at this stage. And I think we need to take that into consideration. In terms of the health sector master plan, I think it's absolutely critical from a policy aspect that we get alignment between the National Department of Health, National Treasury, and the DTIC, because we understand what the needs of the country are from our transversal procurement. And it's critical that we get alignment from a policy perspective in order to make sure we address the needs of the country. We all need highly technological advancements, but at the same time, there are basic needs that need to be met where our people are not being treated. We have rolling stockouts on ARVs. And I think that, you know, as an industry, we have the responsibility to do that. And over and above that, there are tools that exist, such as the NIP program, such as the EEIP. How are we leveraging that to meet the needs of our population? And more so, enforcing those tools in order to get the investment that we require, because through NIP, that already exists. So how do we enforce those tools and make sure that we get the investment and get that going? I think, you know, as a country, we need to really take that seriously, because COVID has laid bare how fragile our supply chains are. And I think we need to look beyond COVID in terms of protecting our country. And in terms of pool procurement mechanisms, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, therein lies a perfect tool in order for us to make sure that we can pool the needs for all of our countries on the continent and then make South Africa an investment destination for the rest of Africa. So, you know, I'd really want to see that as we move forward, that we get more alignment amongst the different government agencies, as well as a clear strategy of how we move forward with localization.
Thank you. Any commentary from the panel?
I can just say absolutely correct. That's it.
And it's on that note that we wrap up our final panel for the day of day one. Thank you so much to all of you. I'd like you to join me in thanking my panel and welcoming them off stage. Thank you so much to my panelists, and thank you to you